Okay, you just brought him up, and I definitely wanted to get to this guy because he is one of the people most responsible for all of this blowback, and is one of the most underrated evil figures in American foreign policy. I'm of course talking about the Carter administration, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Could you talk a little bit about this guy and like what led him to adopt the most like get Carter and the U.S. government to adopt the most maximally hawkish position vis-a-vis Russia and Afghanistan?
Yeah, so I think that the sort of easy way to think about how somebody like Brzezinski comes to direct policy is that he was, sort of tarred and viewed as a lib, because he was a socially liberal guy, but he was always this hardline anti-communist. And the Carter administration was, it came into power and had been elected, and their strategic vision had really been, sort of oriented around like this, domestic response to Watergate. And so that meant that in some respects that like, Brzezinski leading the National Security Council was pretty empowered to engage in some, extensive fun and games as far as policy was concerned to check the Soviet Union. And Brzezinski, as a, sort of measure of course, believed that the Soviet Union's downfall was the overriding necessity for all American policy. Like it was the everything he believed, everything he understood. And, some people we've interviewed, Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, the way they put it is, is that Brzezinski views this as like, it's a throwback to like the 19th century as like a means of like countering imperial Russia. And he, constructed a policy in Afghanistan or helped to along those lines in the 1970s.
Yeah, Brzezinski could never get over not only the history between Russia and Poland in his time, but like hundreds of years earlier.
Yeah.
And he was just absolutely dedicated, fanatical, not even so much against communism, but against what he saw as modern day Russian imperialism, whatever you want to say. And he is unapologetic, or it was unapologetic about using militant Islam to achieve that goal. I found a funny clip where he's being asked by, and I play it in the show later in the show, where he's being asked by an interviewer, who's from that region. You've said that the Taliban were sort of small potatoes compared to taking down the evil empire. Do you still feel that way? And he's unrepentant. He says, "Oh, imagine if the Soviet Union was around now. Just imagine where we'd be." And he says that they were the ones training all the terrorists. And I guess he's trying to say the PLO and secular Marxist terrorists who would, they would hijack planes. It was definitely a dicey time. But he's trying to say they were the ones creating Al-Qaeda because all these Arab terrorists, I guess in his mind, were all kind of interchangeable. But in fact, he was the guy who, more than anyone else, was pushing for this grand architecture of jihad.
Is that the same clip where he sort of chides the woman interviewing him because he's like, if you phrase the question more intelligently, I could answer it more accurately. But when you use terms like bait, it just confuses things. And she just goes, "I'm quoting you directly." And he goes, I never said bait. I never said we would bait them into the Soviet Afghanistan."
There's an interview with a French magazine that he forever once it got embarrassing, after 9/11, he said, "Oh, that's a very loose translation." But it's like the whole interview is just one long misquote. How did that happen? And then we found talking with people who are, on the record or have done their own interviews with colleagues of Brzezinski that he, in private, he was saying that. I mean, whether or not he wants that to be recorded in an article is one thing, but he could never quite help himself telling people, "I did it. I lured them in. I baited the Russians into Afghanistan." And I guess it was a matter of public relations as to whether or not he was supposed to say that after 9/11. But he was insatiable.
And it's also a good illustration of kind of how policy in the late 1970s through the present kind of starts to form on a strategic level, really in the executive branch. Because Brzezinski sort of famously, like a lot of the CIA guys would like deny that there was any trap or something. And they would say, "That's poppycock. We never heard of it." And the way that, Brzezinski, he didn't need them to know about it. He kept things more siloed in particular and was able to kind of influence policy from the top down in a way that I think, with the kind of like people I think of Kissinger as sort of the ultimate, freelancer or whatever. But I think Brzezinski actually probably, deserves a fair bit of credit for, helping to secretly start what would become ultimately like the largest such covert operation in the history of the CIA and probably the history of the whole government.
And would this be Operation Cyclone?
Correct.
Absolutely, sir.
Okay, let's get into Operation Cyclone. This is essentially Charlie Wilson's war, right? I mean,
Yes.
this was our covert arming and backing of the Mujahideen fighting the Soviet army in Afghanistan. So, like, what describe like who was involved in Operation Cyclone and what did it actually entail?
At first, it was a much rougher, smaller, quick and dirty thing, and I think the idea that it started after the Soviet invasion is still present in a lot of vague historical memory. One of the things Brzezinski said in that interview we just cited was that no, I was doing that way before the invasion, at least a year before. but then even before that, the sources we tended to find were very insightful, really argue for almost a whole decade earlier in the early 70s, because what happened then, we won't go too into it now, but there was not a communist, but a kind of progressive revolution in which the monarchy was abolished in Afghanistan. And just like the British 100 years earlier, oftentimes that was like a progressive who wanted to develop his country more was not lining up with our designs or our friends' designs in the region. And so we already were working back then with guys like the Mujahideen, who we'll come to talk about, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Ahmad Shah Massoud, in the early 70s, not even the early 80s. So by the time you get to this turmoil going on with the communists fighting each other, and this guy Hafiz al-Amin, is he on the up and up? Either way, he's a psycho. He's killing everybody he can. The Soviets are very reluctant to go in, but because of the policy that is now definitely in motion in 78 and 79 of basically posing the problem, are we either going to let fundamentalist US-backed Islamic militants take over, or are we going to let this dictator keep making this country more and more into a crackpot, failed revolution just south of our border? Or, and at the end, this was a real consideration, is this dictator going to ally with the US and the fundamentalists? So they kept saying no to troop requests, but eventually, on the bazillionth vote, they finally said, this is probably a big mistake, but we just don't have any better ideas. And that really is what American diplomats said they were hearing. And they say, with regret, that if we had pursued a more conciliatory policy, they don't really believe the Soviets would have invaded, which again is very different from Vietnam. And the two camps in the American government were known as the bleeders and the dealers. Brzezinski was a bleeder. And the dealers were guys like, guys in the State Department, one of whom was unfortunately assassinated in Afghanistan in a very weird and intrigue-laden plot of its own that you can hear in the show. But once that guy was dead, once Brzezinski had started to kind of, block out everyone else and had Carter's ear, Cyclone began to grow. And by the early 80s, Charlie Wilson had really become a CI asset as a congressman, because he was working with Gus Stavrokotos, the Greek guy, who had since upgraded everything, and they both wanted more guns, more Mujahideen, and more money for all of this. So by the mid-'80s, now the Soviets have for years been trying to get out. They tried to go to the UN. They've been putting out feelers for Pakistan, and the U.S. is telling everyone, don't negotiate. The Mujahideen don't negotiate. Pakistan don't negotiate. And so the stingers start arriving in 86 or something. Some people say that's the turning point. Either way, it's already been now half a decade that we've said, we're done when we say we're done. And so all of the BCCI transactions, all of the eventually legitimate, quote unquote, congressional approvals, this stuff is turning the war into something that I don't think anyone, including Brzezinski, might have ever thought would be as destructive for the Soviets, but also for regular Afghan civilians. And by the end of the 80s, I think the American calculation was we've done our job, Leonard Nimoy style. My work here is done, and they beamed out.